All right, so I'd like to take this time to talk to you about the lesson plan that I came up with for understanding measures of biodiversity. Now, this lesson plan is meant for a high school audience. So these are going to be young people who are really just getting the their first glimpse at what biodiversity is and what it means and how we quantify it. So I have some pretty basic and broad objectives for this lesson. I first want to define biodiversity because for many high school students, this will be the first time they've heard of it. And I also want to describe some simple measures that can quantify it. These won't go very in-depth and they're very easy to understand. I'll also, because they're easy to understand, have the students calculate these measures of biodiversity for given data sets and interpret their results. And finally, I want them to be able to analyze the impact that human activity has had on biodiversity in different ecosystems using the techniques that they learned during this lesson. So I came up with a reading that they can do before class. I thought it's probably pretty important that they get some kind of primer into this topic of biodiversity. So I chose a book called Biodiversity. This is written by E.O. Wilson, and I think it's a pretty foundational text for students to read. Because this can get a little technical, I only have them read the very first chapter, The Current State of Biological Diversity. I found that it's a very good overview for what they'll be going into in the future, especially if they want to stay in the biological sciences. This was mostly chosen because it was a text I could get a PDF for. So before class, I will give them access to the PDF of this book, or I will print out a hard copy of the first chapter and give that to them for their first day of class so that in case they can't download these at home or they don't have an e-reader, everybody has equal access to the material before class starts. Um, when class starts, I'm going to have the students split up into small groups of 3 to 5 people. This is a method for making sure that the students are equally discussing material and everyone's having a chance to participate. I don't want to have one big class discussion the whole way through because there'll be some students who feel left out who don't get a chance to speak. And this will encourage them to speak a lot with their peers. The way I'll do this is very simple. I'm going to write their names down on name cards and leave it at the desks. That way the students can enter and be told where they're going to go. So assuming they did their reading, we're going to start the class by asking them what do they think the term biodiversity means to them. So they just completed a reading, it was an overview of biodiversity. Though it didn't delve terribly deeply into topics of biodiversity, I would expect all the students to have some kind of idea of what it is now. And so I want to stimulate discussion in class on what it means, what makes up a biodiverse system, and what meaning biodiversity has to things like medicine, food production, and just ecological balance. This will be class-wide, so we'll not actually make use of the small groups yet because I just wanted to get us started on the right path on how to think about this stuff. That might not be the best method for getting started, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody's focused when class starts. Next, I'm going to give a rather quick lecture on the measures of biodiversity, which is species richness, species evenness, and the Shannon-Weiner index. These are pretty simple ways to look at biodiversity, and figures like the one you see on the screen now are the ways I will help communicate what these are. And I'll also be giving real life examples to the students to give them an idea of how this looks in nature. When you have a certain amount of one species, a certain amount of another species, which and you look at a different environment and you compare the two and you see that, yeah, they have the same number of species, but they don't have the same number of individuals. Okay, so which one's more biodiverse? These are the questions that my students are going to be able to start thinking about as I go through this lecture. And the most important part of this lecture is just to introduce those terms to them because they're going to need that. Next, there will be a group activity. So this is where their small groups are going to come in handy. I'm going to hand out case studies of data sets with species counts for different areas to each group. So each group is going to get their own. I have no idea how many groups I'll actually have, but I imagine 4 to 5 total groups. So it'll be 4 to 5 total case studies provided. And they're going to now use what they've learned about evenness, about Shannon-Meyer index and richness to calculate these measures of diversity using the data sets that they were given. I'm going to have the groups work as individuals first, and then once each person is done, they can then discuss their results in their small groups, compare to see if they all have about the same answers, and hopefully get everybody on the right track when it comes to the math behind these calculations. After the group activity, I'm going to ask the groups to present their findings to the class and explain what those results mean to the ecosystem that they researched. So this is where the case study is really important because now they're going to incorporate the context of what they were learning and synthesize new knowledge from that. And because each group was looking into a different case study, that sharing of information benefits the entire group. And through this system, I'm trying to encourage the students to discuss the impact of human activity on biodiversity in different ecosystems. So in conclusion, we're going to then recap the lesson and go over the importance of biodiversity one more time and the measures that are used to quantify it. By now, the students should all have a very good idea of how we measure biodiversity and why it's important. And I'll go around the room at the very end and ask the students to share one thing they learned or found interesting during the lesson. Hopefully they all found a more profound interest in biodiversity and the biological sciences. Now, to evaluate how well the students went over their material, I've come up with 2 methods. I'm first going to collect the handouts with the sample data sets they were given, and I'm going to then grade the handouts for correctness. After all, every case study did have specific richness, evenness, and index values. So if students were able to get that right, they will gain points. If they got it wrong, they will be docked points. Ideally, no one should get them wrong because they should have the same answers, and through discussion, they should be able to figure out what the correct answers to their handouts were, even if they initially got them incorrect. So there's not much of a reason for students to lose any points here, but it is still possible. Next, their presentations on their case studies will also be graded for participation. And this is going to be very simple. The groups themselves will get 1 grade, but then the individual grades that people get are going to be weighted by how they contributed to the discussion. And this is a way to reward everyone doing their job and lending information and ideas to the total discussion of the class. And this was my lesson plan. I hope you like it. And I also hope I could do a better job articulating it in the written portion. Thank you.